My name is Camille, and at 34 years old, I never imagined I'd be standing here in front of my late husband Thomas's old garage, holding the keys with trembling hands. 6 months after his sudden death, I finally felt ready to sell this space and move forward with my life. I needed the money for our daughter Emma's college fund. Thomas always kept this garage locked, insisting it was just old car parts and tools. Tomorrow, the real estate agent would arrive for the assessment. Before I share what changed my life forever, let me know where you're watching from. Please hit subscribe if you believe that sometimes the most painful discoveries can lead to the most powerful transformations. Because what I found inside that garage rewrote everything I thought I knew about my 12-year marriage. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, I thought I understood what love looked like. My parents had been together for 35 years, and I wanted that same stability, that same certainty. When I met Thomas at the coffee shop where I worked as a barista, everything seemed to fall perfectly into place. It was a rainy Tuesday morning in March 12 years ago now, and he ordered a double espresso with just a touch of cream. His architectural firm was located 3 blocks away, and he started coming in every morning at exactly 7:15. Thomas had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. While other customers checked their phones or tapped their feet impatiently, he would lean against the counter and ask about the paintings I was working on. Yes, I was one of those struggling artists living in a studio apartment that barely fit my easel, surviving on ramen and dreams. But when Thomas looked at my work on my phone, he saw something more than amateur brushstrokes. Our first real conversation lasted until my shift ended. He waited 4 hours, ordering coffee after coffee just to walk me home. On the way, he pointed out architectural details on buildings I'd passed 1,000 times without noticing. The way cornices caught shadows, how Victorian bay windows created rhythm along the street. He saw beauty in structure, I saw it in colour and chaos. We balanced each other, or so I thought. 3 weeks later, he showed up at the coffee shop with tickets to the coast. Not just any tickets, but a weekend stay at a bed and breakfast in Cannon Beach, the kind of place I'd only seen in magazines. I should have questioned how fast everything was moving, but when you're 22 and someone looks at you like you're a masterpiece, you don't ask questions. You just pack your bag and watch the sunset paint Haystack Rock gold, while drinking wine that costs more than your weekly groceries. The proposal came 18 months later, right there on that same beach. Thomas had planned everything perfectly. A private dinner on the sand lanterns, creating a circle of light against the darkness. The ring that belonged to his grandmother, sparkling in a velvet box. He got down on one knee and said words I'd replayed 1,000 times since his death. That I was his anchor, his inspiration, the colour in his black and white world. Emma would come to exist because of that night, because I said yes without hesitation. We married the following spring in a small ceremony, just 30 guests, mostly his colleagues and clients, since I didn't have much family beyond my sister Margaret. Thomas handled all the planning, insisting I focus on my art. He'd transformed a beachside restaurant into something from a fairy tale. White orchids everywhere, silk draping that caught the ocean breeze, a string quartet playing Pachelbel's canon as I walked down the aisle, in a dress he'd secretly commissioned from a designer friend. Our first years felt like an extended honeymoon. Thomas's firm was thriving, designing eco-friendly homes for Portland's tech elite. We bought a craftsman house in Laurelhurst, the kind with original hardwood floors and a kitchen that begged for Sunday morning pancakes. The garage sat detached at the back of the property, originally meant for a Model T, Thomas joked. He claimed it immediately as his private workspace, installing new locks and weatherproofing that seemed excessive for storing tools. I never questioned the garage arrangement. Everyone deserved their own space, I reasoned. I had my studio in the spare bedroom, he had his garage. Marriage was about respecting boundaries, trusting your partner. When delivery trucks came with packages addressed only to him, when he spent entire weekends out there with the doors locked, I told myself this was healthy. We weren't one of those couples who needed to share everything. Emma arrived 3 years into our marriage during the hottest July on record. The pregnancy had been difficult months of morning sickness followed by bed rest, but Thomas never complained. He'd sit beside me reading architecture magazines, allowed his hand on my belly, designing nurseries in the air with his fingers. When Emma finally arrived, screaming and perfect, he cried harder than I did. Watching him hold her for the first time, I thought I understood what complete happiness looked like. But happiness, I would learn, is often just a carefully constructed facade, no different from the buildings Thomas designed. Beautiful from the outside, but you never really know what's happening within the walls until you're already living there. The small cracks started appearing slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice. Client dinners that ran past midnight weekend conferences in Seattle that couldn't be verified, online receipts in his pockets for restaurants I'd never been to. When I mentioned these things, Thomas had explanations that sounded so reasonable. The client dinners were with conservative investors who wouldn't understand having his wife present. The conferences were small, exclusive gatherings not advertised publicly. The receipts were business lunches where he'd grabbed the check for potential clients. His voice never wavered, his eyes never shifted. If lying was an art form, Thomas was Michelangelo. The last time I saw Thomas alive, we argued about Emma's school play. She was playing a sunflower in her kindergarten's autumn celebration, and he'd promised to be there. But at 4:30, just as I was helping Emma into her costume made of yellow felt and green tights, he called to say an emergency client meeting had come up. A Japanese investor was only in town for one night. This could be the project that set us up for life. I remember Emma's face crumpling the way she tried so hard not to cry, because big girls don't cry over small things. Daddy had taught her that. I told Thomas exactly what I thought about his priorities words. I'd held back for months, spilling out like water through a broken dam. He listened silently, then said he'd make it up to us. He always said that. He always believed he would. The play went beautifully. Emma remembered all her lines, didn't trip over her STEM costume, smiled so bright when she spotted me in the audience. I took videos on my phone, planning to show Thomas later, to make him see what he'd missed. But there wouldn't be a later. At 11:43 that night, as I was deleting and redeleting a text message about how disappointed I was, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was professional, detached, trained to deliver devastating news. There had been an accident on Interstate 5 just outside the city. A semi-truck had run a red light. Thomas's BMW didn't stand a chance. He was pronounced dead on arrival at Oregon Health and Science University. They needed me to come identify the body. Those words, identify the body, seemed to belong to someone else's life, someone else's tragedy. Margaret drove me to the hospital while our neighbour Mrs. Patterson stayed with Emma. The fluorescent lights in the morgue turned everything blue-white, made Thomas look like a stranger. But it was him. The scar on his left eyebrow from a childhood biking accident, the wedding ring I'd placed on his finger 6 years ago, the watch his father had given him for graduating from architecture school. All the pieces were right, but the sum was gone. Whatever made Thomas himself had evaporated into the ether, leaving just this shell that looked like him, but wasn't. The funeral was a blur of black clothes and casserole dishes. His colleagues spoke about his vision, his dedication to sustainable design. Clients praised his attention to detail, his ability to translate dreams into blueprints. Everyone had stories about Thomas. I'd never heard projects I didn't know existed, a professional life that seemed completely separate from the man who sang Beatles songs in the shower and made Saturday morning French toast with Emma. Emma kept asking when Daddy would come back from his trip. 5-year-olds don't understand permanence, don't grasp that death is the one journey you can't return from. I told her Daddy had to go help build houses in heaven, that angels needed someone who understood good design. She accepted this explanation with the simple faith children possess, then asked if he'd be back for Christmas. I said no, and she decided we should mail his presents to heaven then. For weeks, I moved through life like a ghost haunting my own existence. Wake up, make Emma breakfast, school drop-off, stare at walls, school, pick up dinner, bedtime stories, collapse into bed, repeat. Margaret practically moved in handling the things I couldn't face. Calling the insurance company, cancelling his subscriptions, boxing up his clothes for donation, but the garage remained untouched, locked, as Thomas had left it. Then came the meeting with the estate lawyer, a thin man named Harrison, who wore bow ties and spoke in gentle, measured tones, like he was constantly afraid of startling me. He'd reviewed all our assets, he said, spreading papers across his mahogany desk, like tarot cards revealing my future. The house had a mortgage with 20 years remaining. The BMW was leased would need to be returned. The savings account held less than $5,000. But that wasn't the worst part. Harrison adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, the universal signals that bad news was coming. There were credit cards I didn't know existed maxed out to nearly $50,000. Personal loans from online lenders at interest rates that made my stomach turn. The life insurance policy would cover most of it, he assured me, but there wouldn't be much left over. Certainly not enough for Emma's college fund, barely enough to keep us afloat for 6 months. How was this possible, I asked, though my voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. Thomas made good money. We lived comfortably, but not extravagantly. Harrison suggested perhaps Thomas had been struggling with the business, too proud to burden me with financial concerns. Men of his generation often felt the need to shield their families from harsh realities. But something in the lawyer's eyes suggested he'd seen this before, knew there were probably darker explanations. The drive home felt endless. Every red light gave me time to replay our life looking for signs I'd missed. The new watches that appeared without explanation claimed as client gifts. The weekend trips to evaluate potential projects that never materialized into actual buildings. The way he'd become protective of his phone, always keeping it face down, taking calls in the garage. How had I been so blind? Or had I simply chosen not to see Margaret, was waiting with tea and sympathy, but I couldn't sit still. I paced the living room, wearing a path in the Persian rug Thomas had bought at an estate sale, insisting it was an investment. Everything in this house felt like a lie, now pretty things masking an ugly truth. Emma played with her dolls in the corner, making them have tea parties, oblivious to the storm building inside me. That night, after Emma was asleep, I went through Thomas's home office with the determination of an archaeologist excavating a tomb. His desk drawers yielded nothing unusual, just architectural magazines, old project files, warranties for appliances. The filing cabinet was similarly mundane tax returns that seemed in order, insurance papers, Emma's birth certificate. If Thomas had secrets, he hadn't kept them here. But then I remembered something Harrison had said. Thomas had been let go from his firm 3 months before the accident. The partners had called it a mutual parting creative differences, but Thomas had never mentioned it. For 3 months he'd gotten up every morning, put on his suit, kissed us goodbye, and gone somewhere that wasn't the office. The betrayal felt fresh, sharp, like stepping on glass with bare feet. I confronted the universe in my kitchen at 2 a.m, demanding answers from a god I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. Why take him before I could confront him, before he could explain, before we could either fix this or end it properly? Death had robbed me of closure, left me with questions that would never have answers, anger that had nowhere to go except inward. The next months taught me that grief and poverty make terrible roommates. I sold Thomas's watches, first the Omega and the Tag Heuer, bringing enough to cover 2 months of mortgage payments. His golf clubs went next, pristine Callaways that he'd only used twice, purchased for client outings that may or may not have existed. The signed first edition books the vintage vinyl collection piece by piece. I dismantled the carefully curated life we'd built. Each sale felt like admitting defeat, acknowledging that the life I thought we had was just an elaborate performance. The pawn shop owner knew me by name, now offered me coffee while he appraised whatever I'd brought in. His sympathy was professional but genuine, the kind that comes from seeing too many people in my situation, women suddenly discovering their husbands were strangers. Emma started noticing the changes, despite my attempts to shield her. Why couldn't she take dance classes anymore? Where did Daddy's car go? Why were we eating pasta so many nights in a row? I invented elaborate stories, creative explanations that skirted the truth. The dance studio was renovating. Daddy's car went to help someone who needed it. More pasta was brain food that would make her smart. She believed me because children want to believe their parents need to trust that we know what we're doing. Margaret offered money, of course. She'd married well, a software engineer who'd cashed out stock options at exactly the right time. They lived in a restored Victorian in Nob Hill, took vacations to places with names I couldn't pronounce. But taking her charity felt like admitting Thomas had failed us, that I'd chosen wrong, that my judgment couldn't be trusted. Pride is expensive when you're poor, but sometimes it's all you have left. The gallery job came through a friend of a friend who remembered I used to paint. It wasn't much manning the reception desk at a contemporary art space downtown, but it offered flexible hours, and Emma could sometimes sit in the back room after school doing homework while I answered phones and sold overpriced prints to tourists. The owner, Gregory, was going through his own divorce. Understood when I needed to leave suddenly, because school called. It was Gregory who suggested selling the garage. He'd been to the house once, dropping off Emma, when I'd had a flat tire and noticed the structure. Detached garages in Laurelhurst were gold, he said. Developers would pay cash to convert them into accessory dwelling units. Those tiny houses Portland loved to pretend solved the housing crisis. 40,000 minimum, maybe more, if the foundation was solid. The idea grew like a seed in dark soil. I'd never been inside since Thomas died, had no use for whatever tools and car parts mouldered in there. The space meant nothing to me except another example of Thomas's need for privacy, his insistence on boundaries that now felt like walls he'd built to hide behind. Selling it would buy us time, maybe even peace of mind. Finding the keys took weeks of searching. They weren't in his office, his car, any of the obvious places. Finally, going through his winter coats for donation, I felt them in a pocket of his black wool overcoat. 3 keys on a ring with no identifying marks, but I knew immediately what they were. The weight of them felt significant, like holding the answer to a question I hadn't known to ask. Jake Morrison, a contractor who'd worked with Thomas on several projects, agreed to do the assessment as a favour. He'd always liked me, sent flowers after the funeral, offered to help with repairs around the house. We scheduled it for a Thursday morning when Emma was at school. I wanted to be alone when I finally opened that door, faced whatever Thomas had deemed so private, so precious. Mrs. Patterson saw me heading toward the garage that morning and called out from her garden. She was 73, had lived next door for 40 years, seen the neighbourhood transform from working class to wealthy. She mentioned how Thomas used to spend entire weekends in there, sometimes late into the night. She'd see the lights on, hear music playing, occasionally voices. She'd assumed he was entertaining clients, but her tone suggested she'd suspected otherwise. Standing at the garage door, key in hand, I felt like Bluebeard's wife about to open the forbidden room. The lock turned easily, recently oiled, and the door swung open on silent hinges. I expected dust cobwebs, the musty smell of neglect. Instead, the space was immaculate, climate-controlled, organised with an obsessive attention to detail that took my breath away. The garage wasn't a workspace, it was an office, a complete professionally equipped office that belonged in a downtown high-rise, not a residential garage, in Laurelhurst. The concrete floor had been covered with bamboo planks, the walls insulated and drywalled painted a soft grey that Thomas always said was calming. Track lighting illuminated everything with museum-quality precision. A glass desk dominated one wall, a 27-inch iMac centered perfectly on its surface. Filing cabinets lined another wall, black metal with combination locks. A leather chair that cost more than our monthly mortgage payment sat behind the desk. But it was the corkboard that stopped me cold, made my knees buckle, forced me to grab the doorframe for support. Photographs covered every inch of the board, overlapping like scales on a fish. But these weren't photos of Emma and me, weren't the family moments I'd imagined he might keep here for inspiration during long work sessions. These were photos of Thomas with a woman I'd never seen before. Young, maybe 25, with long brown hair and the kind of beauty that looked expensive to maintain. In one photo, they were laughing at a restaurant I recognised but had never been to the place that required reservations months in advance. Another showed them on a beach, not Cannon Beach, where we'd been married, but somewhere tropical, with water the colour of precious stones. There was Thomas, at what looked like a company party, his arm around her waist, introducing her to people whose faces I vaguely recognised as his colleagues. The dates on the photos made me sick. A timestamp showed one was taken during what he'd told me was a sustainable architecture conference in Vancouver. Another during Emma's 4th birthday party when he'd supposedly been called away for an emergency site inspection. Years of lies documented in Kodak clarity, displayed like trophies in this shrine to deception. My hands shook as I opened the filing cabinets, each drawer revealing new layers of betrayal, credit card statements for accounts I'd never known existed, charges for hotels, restaurants, jewellery stores, a lease agreement for an apartment downtown, a loft in the Pearl District that rented for $3,000 a month. The tenant's name was Alexandra Chen, but Thomas was listed as the guarantor. There were receipts for furniture delivered to the Pearl District address, a California king bed from Restoration Hardware, a sectional sofa that cost more than my car kitchen appliances I'd dreamed of having in our own home. He'd been building a nest for another bird while I made do with our old dishwasher that only worked on alternate Tuesdays. In the bottom drawer of the second cabinet, wrapped in a manila envelope marked with just the year, I found medical records. Not Thomas's, but Alexandra's. Prenatal vitamins, prescribed ultrasound appointments, genetic testing results. And then paper-clipped to the back a birth certificate. Thomas Chen Jr., born 14 months ago at Providence Portland Medical Center, Father Thomas Mitchell Harrison. Mother, Alexandra Marie Chen. The garage spun around me, or maybe I was spinning, I couldn't tell anymore. I made it to the small bathroom Thomas had installed in the corner, falling to my knees just in time. Everything I'd eaten that morning came up along with what felt like pieces of my soul. Thomas had another child. Emma had a brother she'd never know existed. I was vomiting up years of lies, purging myself of a marriage that had never really existed. When I could stand again, I continued my archaeological dig through the wreckage of my life. A laptop bag yielded another computer password, protected, but with a sticky note underneath that said, Emma's birthday, in Thomas's handwriting. Of course, he'd use our daughter's birthday as his password to hide evidence of his other family. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. The computer opened to an email account. I'd never seen correspondence stretching back 4 years. Love letters to Alexandra, planning their future together, discussing the baby, the life they were building. In one email dated just a week before his death, he'd written about finally being ready to ask for a divorce, to stop living this double life, to be with his real family. Real family. The words blazed on the screen like a brand. Emma and I were the fake family, the obligation, the mistake he was preparing to correct. Every I love you, every anniversary dinner, every family vacation had been a performance, and I'd been too stupid or too trusting to notice. I was acting opposite someone who'd already written me out of the script. But there was more, because with Thomas, there was always more, always another floor to fall through just when you thought you'd hit bottom. Behind a false panel in the back of one filing cabinet, the kind of hidden compartment you only see in movies about spies or criminals, I found a second set of books. Not for his architecture firm, but for something else. Something that made the affair seem almost quaint by comparison. Thomas had been embezzling money, not just skimming a little off the top, but orchestrating an elaborate fraud that involved fake contractors' inflated project costs and money laundering through shell companies. The amounts were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars siphoned from clients who'd trusted him to build their dream homes. And somehow, impossibly, my signature was on dozens of these documents. I stared at my name written in handwriting that looked enough like mine to fool anyone who didn't look too closely. He'd been forging my signature, making me a co-conspirator in crimes I hadn't even known were being committed. If this came to light, I wouldn't just be the widow of a cheater, I'd be the accomplice of a criminal. They could take the house, freeze our accounts, maybe even take Emma away. The room started closing in, the walls pressing closer, the air too thick to breathe. This was why Thomas had died, I thought hysterically. Not because of a random accident, but because the universe couldn't let him destroy us any further. Death was the only thing that had stopped him from completing his plan, from leaving us with nothing, while he started over with his preferred family. I don't know how long I sat there on that bamboo floor, surrounded by evidence of the stranger I'd married. Long enough for the morning sun to become afternoon glare, for my phone to fill with missed calls from the gallery, for my legs to go numb from sitting in one position. I was paralyzed by the weight of discoveries that rewrote not just my past, but my future too. The sound of a car door slamming brought me back to reality. Jake would be here any minute for the assessment, and I was sitting in the middle of Thomas's secret life like a tornado had hit. I started grabbing papers, shoving them back into folders, trying to make everything look untouched. But my hands wouldn't cooperate. Dropping things, mixing up documents, leaving fingerprints on the surfaces, Thomas had probably wiped clean of evidence. Jake's voice called from outside, asking if I was ready. I told him I needed 5 more minutes, my voice sounding strange and hollow in the garage space. I looked around at this monument to deception and realized I couldn't sell it. Not yet. Not until I understood the full scope of what Thomas had done, what he'd planned, what dangers still lurked in these carefully organized files. I emerged from the garage with what I hoped looked like normal composure, telling Jake I'd changed my mind, needed more time to go through Thomas's things properly. He understood, or thought he did, assuming I was having trouble letting go of my husband's possessions. If only he knew I was having trouble processing that my husband had never really existed at all. That evening, after picking up Emma from school, after helping with homework and making dinner and reading bedtime stories, I returned to the garage with a plan. I would document everything, photograph every paper, download every file. Not to protect Thomas, but to protect Emma and myself from whatever legal nightmare he'd created. Knowledge was power, and I'd been powerless for too long. Working methodically through the night, I discovered Thomas had made one crucial mistake in his elaborate scheme. While he'd forged my signature on the embezzlement documents, he'd been sloppy about the timeline. Many of the signatures were dated when I could prove I was elsewhere. At Emma's pediatrician appointments, at my mother's funeral in Michigan, at a college friend's wedding in California. He'd been so confident in his deception, he hadn't bothered to check whether his forgeries would hold up under scrutiny. The Pearl District apartment was my next stop. I drove there at 7 a.m. before Emma woke up, before courage could fail me. The building was one of those converted warehouses, all exposed brick and industrial windows. the kind of place young professionals lived in magazine spreads. I told the doorman I was Thomas's wife, showed him the death certificate I'd been carrying like a talisman, and he let me up without question. Alexandra answered the door, holding a toddler who looked so much like Thomas, it took my breath away. The same dark hair, the same green eyes, even the same way of tilting his head when curious. She was wearing silk pajamas, the kind I'd always wanted, but deemed too impractical. Behind her, the apartment looked like a furniture showroom, everything perfectly coordinated. No sign of the chaos that comes with a young child. Her face went white when I introduced myself. She hadn't known Thomas was dead. For 2 months, she'd thought he was busy with the divorce proceedings, giving me space to adjust, being considerate of my feelings. She'd been texting a dead man's phone, wondering why he'd gone silent, assuming he was being strategic about the separation. We were both widows, I realised, except she didn't even know she was grieving. We sat at her kitchen island, the one with the marble countertop I'd priced but couldn't afford, and compared notes like detectives working the same case from different angles. She showed me text messages where Thomas promised to marry her as soon as the divorce was finalised. I showed her our family Christmas card from last year. Thomas's arm around me, his lips pressed to Emma's head, the picture of a happy family that had never existed. The truth emerged in pieces, each woman filling in gaps in the other's story. Thomas had told her I was mentally unstable, that he'd stayed married to protect Emma from my erratic behaviour. He'd shown her fake therapy notes, convinced her that leaving me required careful planning to ensure I couldn't hurt the children. She'd believed him because he was so sincere, so concerned, such a devoted father, trying to do the right thing. Meanwhile, he'd been setting me up to take the fall for his embezzlement. If his plan had worked, I would have been arrested, deemed both criminal and mentally unfit. Emma would have gone to him and Alexandra, who thought she was rescuing a child from a dangerous mother. The apartment, the hidden money, the new family, it had all been building toward, a moment that his death had prevented from arriving. Alexandra had a son who would never know his father. I had a daughter who'd lost the only father she'd known, and we were both victims of the same elaborate con. But there was something else, something that made both of us reassess everything. Thomas had taken out life insurance policies on both of us without our knowledge. If either of us had died mysteriously, he would have been a very wealthy widower. The coffee in Alexandra's kitchen grew cold as we pieced together the full scope of Thomas's deceptions. She pulled out a tablet showing me spreadsheets she'd discovered on a shared cloud account, detailed plans that read like a criminal's business proposal. He'd been planning to frame me for the embezzlement while simultaneously building a case that I was an unfit mother. The timestamps showed he'd been working on this for 3 years, long before Alexandra, maybe even before Emma was born. But Thomas had underestimated both of us. Alexandra wasn't just a pretty face, she had an MBA from Stanford and had worked in forensic accounting before Thomas convinced her to quit to focus on their family. She'd noticed irregularities in the documents he'd asked her to review, numbers that didn't add up, contracts that seemed deliberately convoluted. She'd started her own investigation weeks before his death, though she'd thought she was just uncovering business troubles, not criminal activity. Together, we found the thread that would unravel everything. Thomas had been using his position at the firm to funnel money through fake construction projects, but he'd needed a partner on the inside to make it work. That partner was Stephen Walsh, the senior architect, who'd spoken so eloquently at Thomas's funeral about his vision and dedication. Stephen, who'd sent flowers every week since the death, who'd called to check on me, who'd offered to help with anything I needed. The evidence was hidden in encoded files on the laptop, but Alexandra cracked them in minutes. Years of transactions, recorded conversations where Stephen and Thomas discussed their scheme, even contingency plans for if they were discovered. But the most damaging discovery was a recorded call from the week before Thomas died, where Stephen threatened him. Thomas had wanted out, was planning to confess everything rather than frame me. Stephen reminded him that they were in this together, that if Thomas talked, they'd both go to prison. We sat in silence after listening to that recording, both processing the possibility that Thomas's death might not have been the accident it appeared to be. The police report had been straightforward. Semi-truck driver fell asleep at the wheel, tragic but simple. But Thomas had been on a route he never took, at a time when he should have been home driving toward a meeting that no one could verify existed. And Stephen had been the one to identify which client Thomas was supposedly meeting, providing an alibi that no one had questioned. Alexandra's son started crying, breaking the spell. As she went to comfort him, I watched her natural maternal grace and felt an unexpected wave of sympathy. She'd been 22 when Thomas found her working as a receptionist at a client's office, eager to believe this successful older man saw something special in her. He'd isolated her from friends, convinced her to depend on him completely, created a world where he was her only source of truth. She was as much a victim as I was, maybe more. When she returned carrying the baby who looked so unnervingly like Thomas, we made a decision that would have seemed impossible hours earlier. We would work together, not for Thomas, not even for revenge, but for our children. Emma deserved to know she had a brother even if the circumstances were complicated. Thomas Jr. deserved to grow up without the shadow of his father's crimes darkening his future. And both Alexandra and I deserved to reclaim our lives from the wreckage Thomas had created. The first step was protecting ourselves legally. Alexandra knew a lawyer from her Stanford days who specialized in white-collar crime, someone who could navigate the maze Thomas had built without triggering the traps he'd set. We needed to get ahead of the story, to present ourselves as victims rather than accomplices, to ensure our children wouldn't suffer for their father's crimes. Marcus Williams met us that afternoon in his office overlooking the Willamette River. He was younger than I'd expected, early 30s maybe, with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested he'd seen too much corporate corruption to be surprised by anything. He listened to our story without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad, occasionally asking for clarification on specific dates or amounts. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair and delivered his assessment with surgical precision. The good news was that we were clearly victims of fraud, not perpetrators. The forged signatures would never hold up under scrutiny, and Alexandra's documented concerns about the financial irregularities showed she'd been suspicious before Thomas died. The bad news was that Stephen Walsh was still out there, likely destroying evidence and building his own defensive position. But there was a window of opportunity. If we moved fast, if we presented everything to the authorities before Stephen realized we knew we could control the narrative, Marcus would reach out to the district attorney's office, arrange for us to come in as witnesses, not suspects. The FBI would likely get involved given the interstate nature of some of the transactions. It would be messy, public, painful, but it was our best chance at protecting ourselves and our children. That night, I sat with Emma as she ate dinner, watching her carefully arrange her peas into a smiley face on her plate. She had no idea that her world was about to change again, that the father she was still grieving had been someone none of us really knew. I thought about telling her about Thomas Jr., about Alexandra, about the possibility that she had a brother, but not yet. First, I had to make sure we were safe, that Stephen Walsh couldn't hurt us, that Thomas's crimes wouldn't destroy the innocent. The next morning, Alexandra and I met at the garage to gather every piece of evidence we could find. Working together, we were more efficient, she handling the digital files, while I organised the physical documents. We found more than we'd expected, including evidence that Stephen had been embezzling long before Thomas joined the firm, that Thomas had discovered it and been pulled in rather than reporting it. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it complicated the narrative of him as the mastermind. In a locked drawer we hadn't noticed before, we found something that changed everything. Thomas had been building his own insurance policy evidence against Stephen in case things went wrong. Bank records, recorded conversations, even photos of Stephen meeting with people Thomas identified in notes as money launderers. But the most damaging item was a suicide note dated 3 days before Thomas died never sent. In it, Thomas admitted everything: the affair, the embezzlement, the plan to frame me. But he also wrote about feeling trapped about Stephen threatening not just him, but Emma and me if he tried to leave the scheme. He wrote about loving Emma more than life itself, about how his greatest regret was that she would grow up thinking her father was a monster. He begged for forgiveness. He knew he didn't deserve, said he was going to turn himself in, face the consequences, try to minimize the damage to everyone he'd hurt. He never got the chance. 3 days after writing that note, he was dead on Interstate 5, killed in what everyone assumed was a random accident. Marcus Williams moved fast once we handed over the evidence. Within 24 hours, he'd arranged a meeting with the district attorney and 2 FBI agents who specialized in financial crimes. Alexandra and I sat in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and desperation, telling our story again, while a court reporter typed every word. The agents asked questions that made it clear they'd been investigating Stephen Walsh for months, that Thomas's death had actually slowed their case. They showed us surveillance photos of Stephen meeting with known criminals, transcripts of intercepted communications discussing money laundering operations that went far beyond what Thomas had been involved in. The architecture firm had been a front for years, legitimate enough to pass casual scrutiny, but rotting from the inside like a building with termite damage. Thomas had been recruited specifically because his reputation was spotless, his presence lending credibility to increasingly bold schemes. The lead agent, a woman named Diane Foster, who looked like she could stare down anyone, explained that Thomas had actually been cooperating with them in the weeks before his death. He'd reached out through an anonymous tip line offered to provide evidence in exchange for immunity. They'd been negotiating terms when he died, trying to verify his information, building a case that would take down not just Stephen, but an entire network of financial criminals operating through seemingly legitimate businesses. This changed everything. Thomas was still a criminal, still a cheater, still someone who'd betrayed everyone who loved him. But he'd also tried to make it right, had risked his life to expose corruption that went deeper than his own crimes. The suicide note hadn't been about self-pity. It had been about a man who knew he might not survive his attempt at redemption. Stephen Walsh was arrested the next morning at his home in Lake Oswego. The news showed him being led away in handcuffs, his lawyer already spinning stories about being a scapegoat for Thomas's crimes. But the evidence was overwhelming. Within days, 12 other arrests followed a network of corruption unraveling like a cheap sweater. The architecture firm was shut down, its assets frozen, its reputation destroyed. For Alexandra and me, the legal proceedings meant months of testimony, depositions, and scrutiny. Our lives were dissected in court, every email analysed, every financial transaction questioned. But Marcus had been right. We were clearly victims, not accomplices. The prosecutors went out of their way to protect us, to make clear that we'd been deceived by sophisticated criminals who'd specialised in manipulation. The hardest part was explaining it to Emma. How do you tell a 5-year-old that her father was both a bad man and a good man, that he'd done terrible things, but had tried to fix them, that he'd loved her even while lying to everyone? I settled for simple truths appropriate for her age. Daddy had made mistakes, big ones, but he'd loved her more than anything. Sometimes adults make bad choices, but that doesn't mean they don't love their children. Meeting Thomas Jr. for the first time was surreal. Alexandra brought him to a neutral location, a park with a playground where Emma could process this new reality through play. Watching Emma push her baby brother on the swing, hearing his laugh that sounded exactly like hers, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger or resentment, but a strange kind of peace. These children were innocent, deserving of love regardless of how they came to exist. Alexandra and I developed an unlikely friendship through the chaos. We were the only 2 people who truly understood what the other had been through, who could laugh darkly at the absurdity of our situation. We started having weekly coffee meetings, then dinners, then joint birthday parties for the children. Emma loved having a brother, even one who lived in a different house. Thomas Jr. would grow up knowing his sister, knowing he was loved, knowing the truth in age-appropriate doses. The financial recovery was slower but steady. The FBI's asset forfeiture proceedings returned some of the embezzled funds to victims, including enough to pay off the debts Thomas had accumulated. The life insurance policies were voided due to fraud, but Alexandra and I successfully sued the architecture firm's insurance for damages, arguing that Thomas's crimes had been facilitated by the company's lack of oversight. The settlement wasn't enormous, but it was enough to start over. I kept the house, but sold the contents that reminded me of Thomas. Every piece of furniture we'd chosen together, every gift he'd given me, every photograph of our fake happy family went to estate sales or charity. Emma and I redecorated together, choosing colours Thomas would have hated hanging my paintings on walls he'd insisted remain neutral. It became our house, not his, a place where truth lived instead of lies. The garage transformation was the most symbolic change. Instead of selling it, I converted it into an art studio, the one I'd always dreamed of having. The false panels that had hidden evidence became storage for canvases. The desk where Thomas had planned his deceptions became my workspace for creating beauty. The bathroom where I'd vomited up the truth became a place to wash paintbrushes, to clean up messes that could be fixed with soap and water. My first painting in the new studio was a self-portrait, but not a traditional one. It showed a woman shattering like glass, each piece reflecting a different version of herself. The devoted wife, the struggling artist, the protective mother, the betrayed woman, the survivor. All of them were true. All of them were me, fractured but not broken, scattered but not lost. I titled it Reconstruction and hung it where Thomas's corkboard of lies had been. The gallery opening happened 18 months after Thomas's death, on a Thursday evening when Portland's art scene came out despite the rain. Gregory had offered me a solo show, my first ever, titled Truth in Shadows. 23 paintings exploring deception, revelation, and redemption through abstract forms that suggested rather than stated. The local press came intrigued by the story of the widow who'd discovered her husband's double life and transformed trauma into art. Emma wore a purple dress she'd picked out herself, playing hostess with a seriousness that made everyone smile. She'd painted her own piece for the show, a rainbow emerging from a black cloud which we'd hung at her eye level in the corner. Alexandra came with Thomas Jr., now walking and getting into everything, his presence a reminder of how much life had changed. She'd started her own forensic accounting firm, specializing in helping women uncover financial infidelity. We were both building new lives from the ashes of our old ones. The painting that drew the most attention was the largest covering an entire wall. It showed two women standing in a garage, surrounded by papers falling like snow, their faces obscured, but their postures suggesting both devastation and determination. In the background, barely visible, unless you looked closely, was the ghost of a man, transparent and fading. I'd titled it Discovery, but everyone who knew our story called it The Garage. 3 pieces sold that first night, enough to cover Emma's dance classes for a year. But more importantly, I felt something I hadn't experienced since finding those photos on Thomas's corkboard. Pride in my own accomplishments, validation that existed separate from anyone else's approval. I was an artist, not because Thomas had encouraged me or because trauma had inspired me, but because I'd chosen to create beauty from chaos. Mrs. Patterson came to the opening wearing her best dress and pearls, telling anyone who would listen that she'd always known I was talented. She bought a small painting of a garden at dawn, insisting on paying full price despite my attempts to give it to her. She hung it in her living room where she could see it with her morning coffee, a reminder that beauty could grow in unexpected places. Stephen Walsh was convicted on 43 counts of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. He got 25 years in federal prison, his assets seized, his reputation destroyed. During the trial, evidence emerged suggesting he'd arranged Thomas's death, bribing the truck driver to fall asleep at a specific time and place. The driver confessed in exchange for a reduced sentence, admitting he'd been paid $50,000 to commit vehicular homicide. It was closure of a sort, knowing Thomas hadn't died randomly, but because he'd tried to do the right thing. The news coverage was extensive, but I refused most interview requests. Our story wasn't entertainment, wasn't a cautionary tale for others to consume with their morning coffee. It was our life, messy and complicated and still being written. The few interviews I did give focused on the importance of financial transparency in relationships, of trusting but verifying, of recognizing red flags before they become burning buildings. Emma started therapy around the same time, working with a child psychologist who specialized in traumatic loss. Through play and art, she processed feelings too complex for her vocabulary. She drew pictures of her family that now included Thomas Jr. and Alexandra, expanding her definition of what family meant. The therapist said she was remarkably resilient, adapting to change with the flexibility that only children possess. Alexandra and I established a trust for both children, funded by the settlement money and my art sales. College would be covered, therapy would be available, opportunities wouldn't be limited by their father's crimes. We named it the Truth and Consequences Fund, a bit of dark humour that made the lawyers uncomfortable but made us laugh. The children would know, their history would understand what happened, but they wouldn't be defined by it. A year after the gallery opening, I started dating again. Not seriously, not looking for another marriage, just remembering what it felt like to be desired by someone who didn't know my whole story. His name was David, a carpenter, who'd been hired to build additional storage in my studio. He was simple in the best way, said what he meant, had calluses on his hands from honest work. When I told him about Thomas, he listened without judgment, then said, "Everyone had ghosts. The trick was not letting them run your life." We took it slow dinners when Emma was with Alexandra and Thomas Jr. for their sibling playdates, afternoon coffee that sometimes stretched into evening wine. He didn't promise me forever, didn't claim to be my soulmate, just offered companionship without conditions. It was enough, more than enough. It was healthy. Emma liked him because he taught her to use a hammer to build birdhouses to create with her hands. The 2-year anniversary of Thomas's death passed quietly. Emma and I visited his grave, leaving flowers and a drawing she'd made of our expanded family. Alexandra and Thomas Jr. met us there, creating a strange tableau of grief and growth. We didn't speak much, just stood together, acknowledging the man who'd brought us together through his betrayal. His headstone read, "Father and Husband," which was true even if the full truth was more complicated. That night, I sat in my studio as rain drummed against the windows, the same rain that had been falling the night Thomas died. But instead of pain, I felt possibility. The garage that had held his secrets had become my sanctuary. The woman who'd trusted blindly had learned to see clearly. The family that had been broken had reformed in a different configuration, like a bone that heals stronger at the break point. I thought about Thomas, sometimes wondered if he'd really loved me in his own broken way, or if I'd been nothing more than a prop in his elaborate performance. But it didn't matter anymore. His motivations, his feelings, his truth had died with him on Interstate 5. What mattered was my truth, Emma's truth, the truth we were creating every day by choosing to move forward despite the weight of the past. The garage studio had become my refuge, but also my resurrection. Every morning I entered the space where my old life had ended and created something new. Paintings that sold commissions from people who'd seen my work, a growing reputation as an artist who transformed pain into beauty. The room that had hidden Thomas's darkest secrets now held my brightest possibilities. Sometimes Alexandra would bring Thomas Jr. to the studio, and the children would paint together while we talked. We'd become sisters in a way, bonded by tragedy, but sustained by triumph. She was dating someone new too, a professor who understood her history without being threatened by it. We joked about our strange family, about explaining it to future partners, about the HBO series someone would probably want to make about our lives, but mostly we just lived. Emma went to school. I painted. Alexandra built her business. Thomas Jr. learned to talk. We had Sunday dinners together, birthday parties, holiday celebrations that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago. We were proof that families could be rebuilt, that trust could be restored, that women could save themselves and each other. The final painting for my second gallery show was another self-portrait, but this one showed a woman standing in an open doorway, light streaming in shadows falling behind her. Her face was visible, this time scarred but smiling, looking forward instead of back. I titled it After, because that's what life had become, the after to a before. That no longer defined me. As I put the finishing touches on the painting, Emma ran into the studio paint already on her school uniform, eager to show me what she'd created in art class. It was a picture of a house with too many windows and a sun with a smiley face, typical 5-year-old art. But in front of the house stood 5 figures holding hands, Hermie Alexandra Thomas Jr., and a figure she identified as Daddy, watching from heaven. I hugged her, this resilient child who'd lost so much but gained even more. She didn't know the full story yet, wouldn't for years, but she knew the important parts. She was loved, she was safe, she had a family that might look different, but was no less real. The rest, the details about embezzlement and affairs and murder, could wait until she was old enough to understand that people were complicated, that love and betrayal could exist in the same person, that sometimes the worst things that happen to us clear the path for better things. Looking around the garage studio, I realized Thomas had given me one gift without meaning to. By forcing me to confront the lies, he'd freed me to live in truth. By hiding his secrets in this space, he'd created the place where I'd discover myself. By betraying our marriage, he'd shown me I was stronger alone than I'd ever been with him. It wasn't the gift he'd intended, but it was the one I'd needed. The garage that was supposed to be sold to save us had saved us in a different way, not through money, but through revelation, not through escape, but through confrontation. Every day I painted in the space where Thomas had plotted against us. I reclaimed a piece of myself. Every canvas that left the studio carried with it the transformation of pain into purpose, deception into determination, endings into beginnings. As the sun set on another Portland day, casting golden light through the windows Thomas had installed to hide his activities, I stood in my garage studio and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not just peace, but power. The power to define my own story, to choose my own path, to build my own future. Thomas had tried to write my ending, but I'd grabbed the pen from his dead hands and written my own. The garage remained standing behind our house, no longer a monument to deception, but a temple to transformation. Every woman who heard our story, who came to see where it all happened, who bought a painting created in that space, took with them a piece of our journey. The message that secrets couldn't stay hidden forever, that truth would find a way, that sometimes the end of everything was just the beginning of something better. What would you do if you discovered your entire life was built on lies? Would you crumble under the weight of betrayal, or would you use those broken pieces to build something new? Have you ever found strength in the last place you expected to find it? Share your own stories of discovery and transformation in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the secrets we keep and the truths we discover, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about real women overcoming impossible odds. Share this with someone who needs to hear that endings can be beginnings, that betrayal can lead to breakthrough, that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for the best thing that ever could. Thank you for listening to my truth, for witnessing my journey from deception to discovery. May you always have the courage to open the doors you're afraid to open, to face the truths you're scared to see, and to transform your pain into power. Remember, we all have garages in our lives, spaces where secrets hide. The question isn't whether you'll find them, but what you'll do when you do.